Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Lily Dite. I'm here on the publicity team over here at Soho Press. And we missed you in August, so thank you so much for coming back for our September event. We've got three wonderful authors that we're going to talk to today, a few of which you probably know already. But first, as always, we're going to do some housekeeping stuff. Of course, we could not do this series without the support that we get from Mystery to Me Books based in Madison, Wisconsin. So, if any of these books sound interesting to you and you cannot wait to add them to your TBR, we do ask that you support Mystery to Me by buying the books with that little green button there at the bottom. At the very end of this event, we will be giving away 3 gift cards to Mystery to Me to randomly selected folks who have just registered and attended the event tonight. So make sure you hold on till the very end to see if you've won. And our next event will be on October 15th at 12 p.m. Central, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. It's going to feature some of our horror authors from our new horror imprint to celebrate Halloween. We're very excited for that. You can sign up for that with the link that I dropped earlier about 20 minutes ago in the chat. And finally, at the very, very end, we're going to be doing some questions. So if you have questions for Jim or Cara or Con, do feel free to drop them in the chat or in that little Q&A box you see on the right side of your screen. We are so thrilled to have them. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the authors that are joining us today. First of all, we have Con Lehane joining us. Con Lehane's books include The 42nd Street Library Mysteries, featuring Raymond Ambler, curator of the library's fictional crime fiction collection, as well as 3 noirish mysteries in which bartender Brian McNulty muddles his way through the crime-infested streets of New York in the 1980s. Con has published stories in Ellery Queen and Alfred Hitchcock mystery magazines. Over the years, he's been a community college professor, union organizer, labor journalist, and has tended bar at 24 or so drinking establishments. He holds a Master of Fine Arts degree from Columbia University School of the Arts and has taught fiction writing and mystery writing at the Writers Center in Bethesda, Maryland. Con, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Of course, we have Cara Black, who is the author of 21 books in the New York Times bestselling Amy LeDuc series, as well as the World War II thrillers 3 Hours in Paris and Night Flight to Paris. She has won the Médaille de la Ville de Paris and the Médaille d'Or du Rendement Culturel. And Cara, you can say those better than I can if you'd like to.
Good, you did really well, Lily. Good job.
You. And she's received multiple nominations for the Anthony and Macavity Awards. Her books have been translated into German, Norwegian, Japanese, French, Spanish, Italian, and Hebrew. Cara, thank you for coming back.
Thank you.
And we have James R. Benn is the author of the Billy Boyle World War II Mysteries. The debut, Billy Boyle, was selected as a top 5 book of the year by BookSense and was a Dilys Award nominee. A Blind Goddess was longlisted for the Impact Dublin Literary Award. The Rest is Silence was a Barry Award nominee, and The Devouring was a Macavity Award nominee. Benn, a former librarian, lives on the Gulf Coast of Florida with his wife, Deborah Mandel. Jim, thank you for joining us. Fresh off of tour for you too. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
We are celebrating historical mysteries today, but not even just historical mysteries. Our uniting theme is specifically books that take place kind of during the latter half of World War II or just after. Each of your books is set in this time period around the 40s and 50s in a collection of different places. So I was curious if you'd like to give us each a little bit of a description of what is going on in the places where you've set your books during the time that your book is set. And anyone can start. Maybe Cara, do you want to begin?
Sure. I'm going to talk about Huguette, which comes out in December. And this is set in post-war France, after Jim's time, post-liberation. And what really struck me is that there weren't many books written about this time, and it's very important. And there was so much. Europe was kind of devastated, and as well as Britain. And I thought I really want to write about that time that is not often addressed, and how there were, what happened with people coming back from the camps, from the war, from all those kinds of things. And so it's a time I haven't explored. But there were a lot of similarities because the the war was over, there were so many other, traces left with rationing, and infrastructure was ruined, spotty electricity, heating. And so a lot of, they had the coldest winter in Paris in 100 years after liberation. And it was, almost, people said the war ended. So I just thought that was a really interesting time to explore. But Jim, this is your field, so.
Well, so this book, which is number 20 in the Billy Boyle World War II mystery series, kicks off on Christmas Day, 1944. And what I'm finding interesting about writing at the cusp of that year is that the big events, D-Day and all the major things had already happened. And the more I study the first part of 1945, the war should have been over. Germany should have surrendered. It was defeated. It was devastated. Armies destroyed, cities burning, but fanatics keep on fighting. And I think that's going to inform the next books, that attitude of, well, we've defeated them. Why won't they stop? And how many more lives have to be lost in order to get them to stop? And it's what happens when you come up against fanatics and true believers. So I hadn't anticipated that. I hadn't really thought about it, but it struck me as a very unique turning point.
That's interesting, because I just saw Con in New Orleans at BoucherCon. We missed you, Jim. And I don't know if you were the first night, we went to the World War II Museum, which Jim, you had told me about when the BoucherCon before. So I got there, and there is this incredible exhibit of the Battle of the Bulge. Did you get to see that?
Yes, yeah.
Con, I don't know if you got there that night, but it was just amazing, what they did, and what you said is true. I mean, it was, fanatics, they just didn't stop fighting, and everyone thought the war's over, or should be. Yeah.
No, I didn't go to the museum. I wish I had, and I intended to, and I forget what came up, but I didn't go there. The period that my book takes place in is after the war is over, and it was a time of remember my background is in the labor movement. It was a time of a tremendous activity in the labor movement. A lot of things had been stored up during the war because the labor unions had made agreements with the government, or most of the labor unions had made agreements with the government not to strike during the war. And so there were a number, dozens, hundreds of strikes all over the country all the time. But New York City is sort of the center of the labor movement. At that time, it was an industrial city in a lot of ways, particularly for the garment industry, but also machine shops and textile shops and stuff like that. And what also happened, I don't know, there's kind of an echo. Are you hearing that? I'm hearing something, yeah. Is that from me?
I'm not totally sure. We can try muting maybe when we're not speaking, but other than that, I think it's all right.
All right. Well, I'll just go. At any rate, also shortly after, I'm sure you all know, shortly after the end of the war, in 1950, the year the book takes place, the Korean War started. Somewhere there'd always been a history of anti-communism. As long as there had been communists in the United States, there'd been an anti-communist movement, but it really became a tremendous social movement, anti-communism. And that interested me because it had a major effect on the labor movement. And what happened was that in 1949, 48, Walter Reuther
was the right wing of the CIO. He was the head of the auto workers and a progressive guy, but the militancy of the labor movement at that time in the CIO was tremendous. And by the time 1950 was over, or 52 or whatever, he had become the left wing of the labor movement. So everybody to the left of the Rotary Club basically had gotten thrown out of the labor movement along with the communists. And I thought that had a major effect on what kind of labor movement the United States has had ever since, including the moribund labor movement we have now. So that was the background. And then the story within the background has to do with something that I remember from when I was young.
And in reading your book, it was so grounded in reality, it seemed. I wondered, do you have any family background in the labor movement or the...
I wondered that. Yeah.
Actually, I don't. There was my father was a worker. He was a gardener on private estates. And when I was a little kid, we were, at that time, or maybe after that, during the 50s, still the anti-communist hysteria, there were a half a dozen gardeners there on this convent of the Sacred Heart, a girls' school. They tried to organize a union, and my father was one of the in opposition to the union. He didn't want to do it. And my first experience with the labor movement, I was a strike breaker by accident. I can explain that later, but I was a cab driver. Anyway, but it was entirely accidental that I was.
Wow.
I was going to ask you about this too, Con. Quickly though, before we forget, Jim, you mentioned that this is the 20th Billy Boyle book. And next year, 2026, will be the 20th anniversary of Billy Boyle, which is, of course, your first book in the series. And so, one, I wanted to call that out because it's a huge accomplishment and something really to celebrate. But also, I'm curious how Billy has changed as a character in 20 books in 20 years. And also, what is it like to spend so much time with a character?
Well, he's definitely sobered. I think the first book, when I wrote the first book, I had no idea it would keep on going. And I wrote it as sort of a typical brash Yankee who doesn't really want to accept any responsibility. And I think that part of his character is still there, but the weight of everything he's endured. Now, it hasn't been 20 years, but it feels like it for him, I'm sure, in war years. The weight of all that has borne down on him, and he still struggles to keep his irreverent attitude and his kind of cynical outlook on things. But he is being forced more and more to take on responsibility and move in ways that he would have thought silly in the beginning. So sobered, I think, is one way to say it. And I think even in the book after this, there's going to be even greater demands on him to do that. So I'm putting a little pressure on him to grow up a little bit, but without losing his cynical outlook on life.
I should be able to answer that because I read the first book in the Billy Boyle series a few weeks ago, and I'm halfway through the what is it, the 19th or 20th that I'm reading now?
If it's reading now, probably the 19th.
The arc of the book that's coming out.
Then that's the 20th, yeah.
So at the end, when I finish this book, I'll be able to let you know the answer.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading it, and I haven't got to some parts in the book, but he is sobering up. Not in the, I'm talking alcohol, but yeah, I mean, he feels differently, and I can't reference it as Con does because I read the first Billy Boyle a while ago, so I have to say that.
Yeah, I really wanted it to not become, a Hogan's Hero fun adventure in the war, and it could have gone that way if it wasn't handled properly. So, but he's still a wise ass. That's not going to stop.
I didn't know about that. I didn't get that the Boston Irish until I read the book, and it was
Right.
just so great about. I half my father's relatives were in Boston when I was growing up, so I knew the area. And also the idea of the hostility of the Irish to the British in the Second World War and their reluctance to get in. I don't think that's something that's very well known. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. Well.
Speaking of long-running series that we've watched a lot of growth happen, Cara, Huguette is kind of a departure for you because it's a standalone, but there are some ties, of course, to some of the other characters that you've written before, which we'll talk about. But first of all, I was curious about Huguette and what the process was writing it because it takes place in France, but it is set outside of Paris since Huguette cannot return to her home city after the war. So, can you talk about what it was like to set a novel outside of Paris after you have written so many based there, and if the research process was different for you at all?
That's a great question. And the research process was the same and yet different too, because I needed to research and really, get boots on the ground outside of Paris. So I spent a lot of time in Boulogne-Billancourt, which is 50 minutes on the metro from the center of Paris, just adjoining. It's on the Seine. And I was fascinated because we're talking a lot of what Huguette's story takes place on a film lot, because that was the center for all the filming, the studios before the war, during the war, and even after the war. A lot of them did get bombed. And now, when I've been doing research the past few years, it's totally different because some of those studios have moved. They've been changed into certain office buildings. A lot of things have really changed. And that used to be an area where they made the Citroën, huge auto manufacturing there. It was a huge source of employment. The whole neighborhood around there was all based on making cars, and then they had to turn it to airplane parts for the Germans, and that's all gone. And so what really helped me was finding a friend there and looking at the old photos of what it looked like during this time. So that was really different. I had to use a lot of archival sources, which was great. So it was different. And then to think about the feeling of the people who would have been so, welded, working class people who were working in a factory. And then next to these big film studios, where all these movie stars were coming in and out, and the people that worked on the set. So that was different. Also, there's some scenes set in Lyon, which is, the Lyonnais will say it's the gastronomical, place in the world because they're very proud of their food, rightly so. But as a Parisian, Huguette would have different opinions. so, I got to explore that, and also, the historical events. I mean, it used to be the silk weaving capital, and they had, from medieval times, and it has, and it's really a very interesting city, and even though I love Paris, I have to say, researching and staying in Lyon and enjoying the food there, really kind of gave it a lot of pluses in my book. And there's a lot of history, and the atmosphere. You're down south, even though it's 2 hours by train, fast train from Paris. There's a different feeling. It's more slower paced than Paris, and so I discovered a lot of things that I didn't know about. And also, it's where the part of the French film industry was created in Lyon, the Lumiere brothers. So that was fascinating to find out about, and find out about French cinema, because French people, they love movies, right? They just love movies. They go to movies all the time, and how important it was in people's lives during the war, before the war, because there was no TV, and people would do that, So it was different, and also to think about them trying to envision the mindset of people living at that time. They wore pre-war clothing because I think Con was talking about textiles, and there were no factories, making fabrics anymore. So people were walking around in pre-war clothing, and it was a very different mindset. And there's lots of photos. Klaus Barbie had in the Gestapo, tortured people in Lyon. It's quite famous for that. So finding that and kind of, I guess, coming to that time era was it was great. I loved it. It got me out of that, Parisian Aimé Leduc mode for a while.
Which we will talk about, Aimé Leduc and all of that and shortly. But yeah, thank you for that. It's interesting because I think a lot of folks, myself included, love the Aimé Leduc books because you do kind of get that sense of travel through Paris, and you get the same thing in Huguette. We just get to explore a different part of the country, which is very cool. Con, I wanted to circle back because we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to ask you directly also. You are a lifelong labor activist and have had multiple roles, as we have learned in, and you're also a labor educator who has worked with unions in a variety of industries, from healthcare to education to entertainment. How does experience like this influence a book like The Red Scare Murders?
Well, I mean, it's sort of, I write imaginatively. I don't outline. I mean, I had a sort of, I had an idea of the period I wanted to write about. And I was also a bartender. So the labor movement comes up in all my books, but I also find, by the second or third chapter, something's happening, a scene is happening in a bar, also. So there we go.
Whoops. Oops.
So I mean, it's just I can't, it's just there. It's just part of my subconscious, and when I start writing, I'm inclined to write about. McNulty, my bar is a union bartender. The woman character in the 42nd Street Library Mysteries is the union steward for the library. So it's all just there. It's my background, and it's who I am. So that's what comes out when I write.
Absolutely.
I didn't know you had been a bartender, but I can really see it now.
Yeah, that's
I can see that, Con. Yeah.
I was an organizer for the bartenders union, the hotel and restaurant workers union also.
Wow. All right. This is one of my favorite questions to ask folks, and if you've tuned into the lineup before, you maybe have heard this question, but I will ask it again. Writing books like these must require an immense amount of research. Obviously, we're pulling on personal experience, and long, in the cases, especially of Jim, I'm thinking long years of researching the same topic. But you all have very specific things that you have focused on for these books. And I can imagine that there's a lot that you can't fit into your novel when you're doing research. So do you have any fun facts or informational tidbits that you learned while researching for your novel that you weren't able to include in the novel that you would like to relay now here in front of all of us?
Well, when I started going down the rabbit hole of French cinema, they started Méliès, Melies, I think made the first movie. The Lumiere brothers did another first movie. I just really couldn't get enough of that. And there was of course, I forgot her name, a French woman who became a director of silent shorts. And she was the first woman director. She happened to be French, and she was hugely popular. Again, these are kind of very quick shorts. And I had no idea about this. I know Jodie Foster made a film about her, exploring that. And I'll give you the name later, and we can put it in. And then she, for some reason, moved to New Jersey. and, and from France, and started, doing film there, small films. I mean, we're talking a long time ago. So I really would love to have brought her into the book somehow, even though it was before Huguette's time. Claude wouldn't have known her, but I would love to have brought that in. But again, it's what serves the story, right? As our editors tell us. So yeah, it really needed to be part of the story. And so I would love to have gotten her in there. But
well, I'm going to bring up George McGovern. So George McGovern, former senator from South Dakota and presidential candidate, shows up in this book at the very end. And he was a B-24 bomber pilot during the war. And I don't want to talk about what happens in the book with him. But I read a lot about what he did during the war, and especially afterwards, how he was one of these guys who just never really wanted to talk about it. He actually refused to let anybody bring it up during his presidential campaign because he thought it was inappropriate. Man from a different time. But what really, one story that I wished I could have worked in, and it just wouldn't have been possible, was something that really anguished him for a while. He was returning from a mission, or he had to abort early because of a technical problem, and they had to ditch their bombs so they could fly safely back to base. And he was flying over Austria, and he could see a farm below, and they just had to let the bombs go, and it hit this farm. And he said, I always worried about what happened to this poor farming family. And these are big 500-pound fragmentation bombs. He was on a radio program in Germany telling that story. And I looked this up. This really did happen. I confirmed this. The farmer called in, the elderly gentleman called in and said, that was my farm. You hit a barn. Nobody was hurt. And we felt it was a small price to pay. So he got vindication or relief after years and years of just that sort of preying on him. And I thought, what are the odds that somebody who could understand English was listening to that program and heard that story? But so anyway, if you're going to pick up this book, watch for George McGovern at the end. And it was just, without giving anything away, it was one of those cases where the research pays off because he showed up right at the right time in my plot, doing exactly what he was really doing at that moment. And he helped move the plot forward. And he unstuck me. And I didn't have to change a thing from the historical record. It was great.
I'm not sure I can think of a fun story of the what happened during the McCarthy era, and probably what was most interesting to me is, for every communist that was thrown out of the labor movement, they threw 10 other progressive union leaders or union organizers who weren't communists, and just a lot of lives were ruined, and I think there's an overriding misunderstanding of what that whole era was about and why there was. The communists really weren't a danger to anybody in the United States. At the most, there were 100,000 communists in the Communist Party. But they were really, really good union organizers. They were really militant. They were really dedicated, and they built democratic unions. So the attack on the communists was really an attack on workers and unions, and an attempt to solidify the control that the oligarchy or the ruling elite had on the country. And it not just happened in the United States, but all over the world. So I don't think that came into, I don't proselytize when I'm writing a story. I really do believe in imaginative writing. And so I imagine my way through stories. But anyway, so that was something I would hope that got in there that probably didn't, but it's not much fun.
I met Gus Hall once.
Did you?
Yep. And very briefly, I'll just say I was thrown out of the Communist Party. So this was during the Vietnam War. There were protests in New York City. Some of them took place over in the winter, and it was New Year's Eve, and a bunch of us had gone down from the University of Connecticut. We ended up sleeping in a church after the demonstration, and we got an invitation from the Communist Party. They were having a New Year's Eve party, and they thought, well, these kids, we can invite them to come. So we thought, cool, we went. And it was sort of like going to the Rotary Club. I mean, it was so bourgeois. It was, just a bunch of people sitting around tables. And we thought, well, these guys are cool. So we pulled out a few joints and started smoking. And Gus Hall came over and threw us out of the Communist Party party.
I'll tell you, at one time in the 80s, I was tending bar on the Upper West Side of Manhattan when it was still a pretty, what do you call it? They call it, one of the agents rejecting my book called it the underbelly of New York. But it was a 4 o'clock bar, and there was a numbers runner who used to come into the bar. And he appears in my first book, and I can't remember. I call him Doc in the book, I think, or maybe that was his name. I don't remember. But he lived across the street from Gus Hall in Rockland. And thought that his favorite thing to say was what the numbers runner was, whether someone was a gentleman or not. I was a gentleman bartender. He liked me, but I mean, he wasn't a runner. He controlled the numbers on the whole Upper West Side. A dozen numbers runners doing it. But anyway, he and Gus Hall were neighbors and pals, I guess.
I found the name of the director, which I should have had. It's Alice Guy Blache, Guy-Blache. She's considered one of the very first filmmakers in the world. She was the first woman to direct a narrative fiction film and a prolific director and producer. And
Is
shame
this
on
the
me.
one that Jodie Foster made a film about? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, see if you can rent that. It's fascinating. Totally fascinating. But she didn't make it in. Sorry, Alice.
Next time. Oh, it's my favorite question. I learned so much. There was, we did an event in the summer, and we had Zoe B. Walbrook, who just wrote her debut mystery about a professor, a history professor at a college. And she said that or it might have been Maha Khan Phillips. It was one of the two, but when she was doing her research, she found that they used to grind up mummies to put into paint because the paint was like this very sought after color, but it actually was ground up mummies that went into this paint. Anyway, the fun fact book has really grown. So thank you all.
As one does, no.
As it does, yeah, as one does. Cara, you mentioned Claude, so I think that we should just go ahead and talk about Claude Leduc. Leduc. Yes, of course, because although Huguette is a standalone, we do meet Claude Leduc, who is a private investigator who would later inspire his granddaughter, Amy, to become one as well. Where did Claude come to you in this process of writing Huguette? Did you always know he was going to be a part of this, or did it come to you more organically? How did you decide to introduce us to Claude in Huguette?
Well, that's a good question because I've always loved Claude. A lot of people have told me, oh, you should write about Claude. And I was like, well, I've got to find his story. And then I started thinking about, well, what's really important to Claude? Who is this character that has always been in the shadows? Who is this person that Claude would go to a cafe and he'd set Amy down in the back leather banquette booth and have her do her homework under the tutelage of the head waiter, and he would disappear upstairs of the cafe. And I thought, and Amy only later discovers, when she's much older, oh, Grandpa was going up to see his mistress. She's a woman we never talk about in our house. It was never, it's just this person we don't talk about. And so I was like, who is this woman? Why was she so important to Claude? Why would he do this? And I didn't know anything about her, but I thought, who could she be? And how could they meet? And how could it be a story after the war? And how could she, and this story does take place over a few years, unlike, 1 week, like Amy's stories. But so how could that progress, and how could their relationship, if they, start or, run into obstacles? And so it really came from Claude. And I was thinking now, I made a timeline when Claude was born, when his son Jean-Claude was born during the war. And I thought, how would Claude have grown up? Would his father have been in World War I? Where was he from? Why was he in Paris? And I got to really explore all those parts. So Claude is from Auvergne and came to the big city. Well, he joined the army and went to the big city, to Paris, because that's where there was work. He joined the police because a lot of young men wanted to, make a difference, and they had jobs and there was a pension, and he thought he would, be doing good. And he discovers a lot in this story, and we see why he hangs out his shingle and becomes a private detective. But having all these contacts. So it's kind of a bit Claude's origin story that I got to figure out and to think about how he would reflect those times. And, again, kind of mirroring it with, what kind of grandfather he was to Amy. And that was really fun because he loved her and she loved him, and, he helped raise her, and what was that about? So, Claude could be my grandfather any day, I tell you. He cooks. Yeah.
It's not a small thing.
Yeah, he's a very good cook, and that's very important to him. He haunts the auction houses and furnishes his, apartment on Ile Saint-Louis with these things at auction. And when Amy inherits the apartment, she's like, I remember going with my grandfather there. And so we, but he bought all these things, and what can I do with them? And, but she can't not have them there because he's so important to her, and it's memories. She inherited his office with his desk, and, and of course, Amy's partner, Renee Friant, computer hacker extraordinaire, wants to move into something new and make it modern and get all their electricity upgraded and get, all this. And she's like, no, I want to stay here. I know you're very, you want to be current and you want to have this modern glass and steel office, and she's going,
nope.
Not yet. Not until we lose our lease or we're kicked out. So a lot of memories for her.
Yeah, absolutely. Con, I'm going to spin this back over to you. And I suppose this could be a question for everyone. But I really loved David Downing blurbed The Red Scare Murders. And at the very end of his blurb, he called it a picture of America, which these days feels like fake history, but isn't, which feels very true. And of course, this story is set in the 50s, but unfortunately, it feels more and more timely. What do you hope that readers take away from your book, if anything, in 2025?
Well, so again, like I don't think of myself as a proselytizer, even though it's a very political book. I think it's just I'm placing this story. This is what happened, and people can, draw what they draw out of the story and the background. But what interests me really about the time is how easily institutions like universities, newspapers, uh, businesses, unions caved to the orthodoxy, and how difficult or unusual it was for people to act. Mick Mulligan, my character in the Red Scare Murders, is not a particularly heroic guy. He's not a particularly tough guy. He can't fight off 9 people at the same time like an action hero, but he has integrity, and he acts out of his own integrity, and that's something that was missing. You know who stood up? The librarians. And actually, they were the ones who stood up a few years ago after 9/11, when the whatever it was running. The Patriot Act was just destroying what we thought were rights of everyone in the country were just taken away, sort of like what's happening now. But librarians stood up to the Patriot Act. They stood up to the McCarthy era when very few other institutions did. And I'm glad I'm not talking about my librarian books with Jim here, I can tell you.
Yeah, amazing how it resonates today,
Mm-hmm.
Really,
Yep.
Con. I know we have some librarians who have joined us, and I'm sure they'll probably chime in. But yeah, it's quite amazing. And Jim, I mean, how many years were you a librarian? I never asked you that.
Probably about 25 or so. Then I moved into information technology, but my true love was being in a public library and working directly with people. That was great.
Wow. And how old was everybody when they got their first library card? That's you, Lily, too.
I think I remember going into the library and getting it in the children's section.
I remember getting mine. I was in first grade, and the public library was across the street in Greenwich, Connecticut from St. Mary's School, where I went to school. And I remember my first book, it was about Matilda the cat. And I think I took it out about 6 times before. That was, I remember that very well.
How about you, Lily?
I think I was also first grade. And my library wasn't across the street, but it was very close. We biked to it. I don't remember the first book I took out. What about you, Cara?
I remember going, it was the summer before first grade. My father took me to the library to get my first library card. And then we went across the street to the Baskin Robbins ice cream store. Yeah, I don't know if you have that back east, but I was like, and I got an ice cream, and we went to sit in the park, and I was like, this is heaven, He was perfect, right? You get your library card, you can have books, and you have ice cream. And I'm like, this is it. I mean, what more? So I've always...
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was just wonderful, really wonderful.
Yeah, it doesn't get better than that.
I know. With your dad, and you get to have ice cream and a book. Oh, yeah.
Folks, if you have questions for Jim or Con or Cara or all of them, go ahead and stick them in the chat. I want to hear one more story from Jim before I ask what the rest, what you're up to next. But the book opens on Operation Corona, which was a real operation carried out by German-speaking members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, many of whom happened to be Jewish refugees who would countermand German orders over radios by speaking German. And to prepare for this specifically, I did do a little research, but I would love to hear why you decided to put Operation Corona at the forefront of your novel, and tell us a little bit about it, just because it's very interesting.
Well, in searching around for the plot line for this book, I became fascinated by the extent to which the British especially used electronic warfare in World War II. It was more sophisticated than ever thought. Part of it was spoofing the German operators by using German-speaking people to countermand orders and create confusion. But they also used a lot of advanced technology to warp the radar that the Germans were using, so they wouldn't identify the bomber stream going over Germany at night. And I wanted a way to talk about that, but it was kind of dry and technical. But then when I found out that they employed these German Jewish refugees for their language skills, but also for their technical skills, they trained them in the technology. They put men in the bombers to do it as they were flying over Germany, and they used the women at the secret air bases to do the same thing. And I was a little fascinated by the sense of the other, that here are people who they're not part of Great Britain, really. I mean, they're there, but they came from Germany. They're Jewish. They had, I think the British are a little insular when it comes to foreigners. So they were foreign in two ways. And the men, especially, when they were put on a bomber, usually the bombers flew with complete radio silence to not attract any electronic attention. But these guys were tasked with working the electronics to subvert the German radar, and which meant that their one plane, was lit up like a Christmas tree, electronically speaking. They were called Jonahs because they were so dangerous. It was very dangerous to be on an aircraft with them because you were targeted before any others. So that was another level of otherness. And I was fascinated with how these folks conducted themselves and worked so hard at what they were doing when they were never really quite accepted or reluctantly accepted. And then when I stumbled upon, there's a lot of websites where these folks who survived are telling their stories. And one woman was talking about her commanding officer, Squadron Officer Conan Doyle. And I said, did a double take, Conan Doyle? What? So, sir, I knew it wasn't Sir Arthur because he was already dead. But his daughter, Jean Conan Doyle, was actually an intelligence officer in the RAF. She was a squadron officer, and she commanded one of these units. She commanded these women at a base where they did all this work. And I thought, well, Billy and I are both fans of Sherlock Holmes, so I'm not going to pass this opportunity up. So Jean Conan Doyle is involved in the initial investigation, and Billy's a little starstruck at meeting her. So that was a lot of fun. It was one of those times when, again, you just do enough research, and all of a sudden this little gem floats to the top, and it's perfect to use.
Never knew that. Truth is stranger than fiction.
Absolutely. And she went on to command the women's Royal Air Force after the war into the 50s. She made quite a name for herself.
Wow.
Who knew?
Through you, we do.
You mentioned finding those gems. One of the gems that I found was a book called Dancer in the Revolution. And it was by an African-American guy who grew up in Harlem and would dance, was a dancer for, all of the big jazz, Dizzy Gillespie, all of the big jazz bands at the time. He was also a Communist Party member. And I revised the whole section of my novel when I found that book and that guy. It was amazing.
Yeah, you can't pass that stuff up.
Agree. Yep.
We have a question from Raul, who often does tune into our lineup events. So thank you for coming back, Raul. And it's for everybody. As English language writers, please share the good and bad of translations for your books. Thank you. Merci and gracias from Los Angeles.
I can answer that really quickly. I don't have any books translated. So I don't know.
I only have one. It was translated. One book was translated into Polish, and that was it. So I think we got to hand this off to Cara.
Well, I think the Spanish version, I remember the translator emailing me quite often saying, she said, I know I'm trying to get this from you who write in English, and when you use these French words, to authenticate or, make it feel like, this is a French story, how, how, how I'm thinking how I can do it to give justice to the sprinkling of French words in the story, and how I can do it in Spanish. And it was really interesting. It was very thoughtful of her, to think about that and how it would be, for a Spanish reader. So we had some really great back and forth. And I really appreciated a translator's trying to get the nuance, and to understand and to present it. The French translator, not so nice, of course. But so it was really interesting. But actually, my friend who read it said, I think it's an okay translation, a French journalist. So once he said that, I was like, fine, if you think it's okay, if it works for you, I'm good with that. I certainly can't correct it. I will say when the first were published in Britain, UK, they changed things like boot, trunk for boot, and all those. Yeah. I thought that was fascinating. Maybe I just, So I always say, yeah, I've been translated into Brit too.
Actually, I misspoke. My first books were translated into French. My first book I sold in France before I sold it in the United States to Ravage Noir.
Good publisher.
The three of my first books, I forgot, and I was reviewed in Le Monde, which I thought was the highlight of my career. So
huge.
We have another question from Tom. For Jim, Europe has played an important part of the Billy stories. Will Billy and Kay stay in post-war Europe once peace is declared?
Well, I think I've decided to let Billy evolve organically and decide what he wants to do and what he feels he needs to do, because this question comes up a lot, and I have a feeling he's going to be interested in the Nuremberg war crime trials. And I'm probably going to have to give him some personal reason for being invested in that. But I just don't see him going back home and, putting back on the blue coat of a Boston cop. It's too much has happened to him to go back to that kind of simple life. So there will be something, and I've just decided to write the books, and I've got plenty to go before he has to make that decision, but it'll be a process for him to decide what to do next.
Perfect.
So I'm sure you've been asked this 100 times before, but how did you ever come up with Uncle Ike?
Well, you know what? It was to give Billy carte blanche to go anywhere. Because if he was just a regular military investigator, a captain or a lieutenant, nobody would pay any attention to him. Every colonel or general would tell him to hit the road. But if he's got his Uncle Ike behind him, both as his superior officer and his relative, then he has entree to anything that will help move the plot along. So initially, it was a way to explain why he's elevated to that position early on, because it's a family connection, and then it serves him well as the books go on, so that he can worm his way into any situation he needs to.
Really, that's genius. I've always thought that was very genius. Perfect entree.
Yeah, thank you.
And it's believable. I mean, that's the great thing.
People do favors. That's how it goes.
Thank you, everybody, for your questions. We're about to wrap up here, but very quickly, I'd love to know, and I know this is the worst question in the world. I'm asking it anyway. Cara, Jim, Con, what are you working on next? And if it's just A series on Netflix that you need to finish up. That's an okay answer also.
So somebody go first.
Is
Come on,
Claude
Con.
back? Cara?
Okay, I'm working on the next book, tentatively titled Can Change, Le Duc Detective.
Ah, exciting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I've just sent in the manuscript for next year's Billy Boyle, and I have a little bit of time, so I have worked up a novella that
Ooh.
kind of a horror mystery. It's based on the Frankenstein story, and it takes up with the creature on, if you know the story, he goes off at the end of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein on an ice floe to die in the Arctic. But in my story, I pick up right there, and the brain that he was given, some memories start popping up about what happened to the person who had that brain, and he feels the memories, and that person was murdered. So he decides to not die, but to go back and solve the mystery of who killed his, not him, but the person whose brain he ended up with. So it's a revenge Frankenstein thriller with Napoleon's secret police hot on his trail.
I'm hooked.
A little different.
Wow.
Oh, am I supposed? I just finished my sixth and probably final 42nd Street Library mystery that'll come out in the spring, and I'm working on a new Mick Mulligan book that takes place largely in New Hampshire, where there's an army buddy of Mick's who's also who's a communist and whose father was a communist union leaders in a mill in New Hampshire. So the book starts with his friend Marty LeBlanc getting shot at. Is also been having an affair, and an old lover of his turns up, and the mill is probably going to be getting sold. So all of that's what I'm starting out with, and who knows what I'll end up with. But we're staying with the labor movement anyway.
Thank you for putting up with that insufferable question. I like to know. Before we let everybody get back to their evenings, I am going to announce the gift card winners. Again, thank you so much for joining. This is our way to say thank you for supporting our series and to encourage you to go buy some books from Mystery to Me. Our first gift card is going to Lori Sefton. Congratulations, Lori. Our second gift card is going to Tom Watson. Congratulations. And then our grand prize gift card is going to Pat Fowler. So thank you all for joining us. Again, we'll be back on October 15th. Cara, Jim, Con, thank you so much for giving us part of your evening tonight. We really appreciated it. And Elizabeth, thank you for running us right out to the end. We appreciate
Thank you, Louie. Thank you. A lot of fun, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to Mystery to Me. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your night, and we'll see you next month. Bye, y'all.
Good luck to everybody.
Good luck.